Hello everybody, welcome to Crafty Soup. My name is Misty. Today I am here with Altenew's brand new Mini Delight subscription kit. I want to show you what I got in my kit, show you how to assemble the die pieces, and then make 3 cards. I won't go through step by step of each of the cards. I will, however, highlight a certain technique. And then on the 3rd card, I get really wild with it and step way outside of the box. And then I have a peek of a bonus card as well. So I hope you watch all the way to the end and get inspired by this wonderful little mini kit. So here is my package in the mail. I did not look ahead of time to see what the release was like or what was coming in the kit, so it is a complete surprise to me as I pull this out. And it is a sweet little garden box with some florals in there. And looking at the back of that, I saw the trowel and little rake, and I thought there might be dies for those as well, especially looking at the sneak peeks of some of these projects. And no, there were no dies for that. It's just the dies for the greenery, flowers, and the flower box. Oops, I dropped it there. But I really like the packaging for these little die sets. I'm impressed with this. Normally I would put them on magnets, but I'm leaving them as is. All right, let me show you how to assemble these garden boxes, because when I first pulled it out, I was a little confused. So these little pieces that cut out with the die are kind of the posts to the box, and they do have very slight angles on them to match up with the angles on the die itself. And it's really hard to see, and I got them wrong at first, so I thought I would point that out. They also have detailed texture on the outer part of the boards of the box. So here is what I thought I was doing to put them together, was putting those posts towards the ground as feet, but really they're up towards the top as the top parts of the box posts. So I just glued the where the posts would be to glue these pieces together, and that's going to create a little bit of a pocket. Now, one of my pet peeves with this die set is that you can see through parts of it, and not only will you see some of the greenery when you tuck them into this little pocket, but you're also going to see the background of the card you put it on. So that is, I think, a detail that they did miss on this one. However, I still love the set. I'm still excited to use it, so let's go ahead and do just that. My first card is going to be kind of traditional of what you might think of doing with these products, and it's kind of along the lines of what they showed as samples in the packaging. I'm going to step it up a little bit with a bit of a watercolor technique. I'm going to go ahead and stamp my greenery using 2 tones of ink. I did 1 tone across the whole stamp and then highlighted areas with a 2nd tone of ink color and stamped my image. And then I'm just going to use a wet brush to pull around the ink in those leafy images. And because this is regular cardstock, the ink will not move very much, but you can see the difference here of the washy look you get once you add water. There will be a little bit of problem to doing this on cardstock, which we will get to later. In the meantime, I have gone all the way across. Because I had already glued my grounding on the card, that meant that my stamp could not get right up close to that edge, so I am making do with some pressure and some alternative stamping, but I do the entire background with those leaves, and then I cut out all of my florals and greenery. And if you've never done pin work on your die cuts before, it's not something that I used to do either, and I learned it from another YouTuber, and so I would encourage you to do this because it adds just a little bit more detail to things on your card. And I kept this one pretty simple. I let the flowers drape over the edges instead of all standing up tall, and that completes the first card. Now here's that problem I mentioned, is that the watercolor can cause a little bit of bleed through depending on your cardstock, so you can just cover that up with an extra cut panel on the inside if that is something that will bug you. All right, let's move on to card number 2. I think this one uses the imagery in ways you may not think of at first, and that is using smaller images for repetition stamping. While I did do the stamping in an embossing, a gold embossing powder, I'm just going to show you here how I did this. I lined up my stamps, one upside down and one right side up. I made sure that my cardstock that I was cutting was tall enough to fit the images just barely, and wide enough to be used at a diagonal on my card. And then I went ahead and stamped, and because these images are pretty similar, getting the spacing between the stamping was pretty easy. Of course, if you pull it closer to you, that makes it even easier. And just the fact that you're using lots of repetition both with the stamping and the die cutting and bold colors, that creates a very different kind of card than you might otherwise expect. Speaking of angles, that is the one thing I kept consistent across all of these cards, was using some kind of diagonal angle. If you look back to card number 1, the grounding had a slight angle to it. Card number 2 features a very bold focal angle. And then card number 3 has more subtle angles, but it has a lot of scene building. So let me show you how I did this one. Let's take a look at some of the details of this card and tell you how I did pull a lot of these pieces out of the actual set. So when I was playing with the garden box set, I realized if it turned upside down, it looked a lot like a garden bench. And I'll show you how I had to piece things together to get this slightly different look. When I was playing with the garden bench and cutting pieces apart, I really wanted to use the wood grain texture to create boards. I had started off with the idea of creating a board deck, and it suddenly turned into the idea of creating an entire scene with the siding of a house in the background. I also used the wood grain to create a little birdhouse. I did some paper quilling to create a little bird, my own garden hose. And so I was just getting very creative and artful with techniques that I could do, starting off with the basis of the garden box as a bench and then using the wood grain texture to add a lot of details. My little birdhouse came from the extra parts and pieces that fell out of the middle of the die cuts, so even the waste went to use on this card. Okay, to make this card happen, I had to do a lot of die cutting, and here's a little technique. Have you ever inked a die cut? Here I was inking a different project, and I want to show you side by side the difference that it can make when you have dies that also make impressions. Those impressions will hold on to the ink and give more detail. So I did that first before I cut all of these pieces, and I found notches on the die that helped me line it up, so I was just cutting out the long edges of those board pieces. I'm going to show you how I trimmed everything apart. Now here it has the whole entire section of the board, so I didn't have to cut out those little pieces, but when I had the long boards, I did have to nip the different post parts off, and then I was able to take these boards and glue them together, just a tiny overlap. I used the grid on my mat to make sure everything was straight, and then I had the start of siding for my house. I did line them up all at the bottom so that the overlap of the siding would cover up any uneven edges at the top. Okay, I've already moved on to doing the garden bench. I was holding this shadow piece. It totally reminded me of the bench with a cushion on top and the feet at the bottom. So how could I make it work with the feet at the bottom and still add the detail layering? And I realized the angles are close enough, they're not perfect, that if I trimmed off the small end and then glued it on to the other side, then the angles would line up so I could still have that detail and still make it look like the bench. Now it's not perfect. Some of the white of that cushion layer is showing through, but it worked well enough for my needs. Now I could have decorated that white layer, the cushion layer, before I glued this together, but let me show you what I ended up doing when I was really playing with this. I had a piece of cardstock and I colored it up. Both with ink and with stamping. So if you pull in that leaf stamp from the background and just use one of the small leaves, you don't even need to put it on a block, you can just use your finger. That will add texture and detail to what would be the fabric of a bench cushion. But what I ended up doing when I was building was go ahead and decorate it separately and then glue it on top. You could even add a little foam dot to it to give it more lift and loft. But here is what that bench looks like once I put it together. And here's a look at that bonus card. I used embossing ink to add texture to the background with the stamp, and then I used the flowers on top of the greenery instead of on top of the flower buds, and a simple heat embossed sentiment, and then the little bit of a vellum to create the focal point, and that is the bonus card. So there you go. Those are my 4 projects. I hope you got inspired by something in this video, and if you found something that you really liked, go ahead and drop me a comment. I'd love to know what it is. I'll be back soon with more crafty videos, and until then, I hope you have an artful day.